Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the DEIP Public Forum. Before we get started today, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. And we extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. My name is Darren Miller. I'm the CEO of ARENA, and I'm going to welcome you and thank you for joining us at this inaugural Distributed Energy Integration Program Public Forum. Representatives from across the energy industry have joined us to provide an overview of DEIP and its activities over the past few years. And today we'll reflect on DEIP's purpose, vision, and achievements, and also talk about the next steps for this important work. There'll be a good chance for you to engage with everybody, so please make sure you log into slido.com and using the hashtag DEIP, that's DEIP, and you can see those instructions on the screen. And you're welcome to submit your questions, which we'll be able to hopefully get to during the day. ARENA recently released its new investment plan, which details our investment themes and strategic initiatives for the years ahead. Our mission at ARENA is to support the global transition to net zero emissions by accelerating the pace of pre-commercial innovation to the benefit of Australian consumers, businesses, households, and workers. DEIP has a very strong alignment to ARENA's objectives through supporting the industry to collaborate, share knowledge, and build consensus. And sharing knowledge is crucial for ARENA. It's one of our foundational elements in terms of our statutory functions. Sharing knowledge is actually ARENA's return on investment. When we share knowledge efficiently and openly, we can learn from each other's mistakes, go faster, and we know that the speed of the transition to net zero is crucial. The idea for DEIP came through one of ARENA's A-Lab events in 2018. And one of the first things I did as the new CEO of ARENA in late 2018 was host the heads of the 11 market bodies and industry bodies that make up DEIP to launch this collaboration initiative. Now, DEIP's purpose is to maximize the value of distributed energy resources for all energy users. And over the past 3 years, ARENA has supported the evolution of DEIP through chairing various CEO forums, steering groups, and secretarial meetings, and supporting the delivery of key work streams and reports. And I'd like to take this brief opportunity to thank my team of Craig, Jordan, Kate, John, Caitlin, and Celia for your extremely hard and diligent work on this very important piece of work for ARENA. The Distributed Energy Integration Challenge has an important part to play in supporting an even greater uptake of renewables in Australia. We know from the likes of the International Energy Agency that solar PV is now the cheapest source of electricity in the history of the world, with roughly 30% of Australian households having installed solar. Australia leads the world in this space. And the last few years have seen increasing amounts of large-scale solar and wind committed and deployed throughout Australia. Just looking at a few data points, the Australian PV Institute estimates that the potential for rooftop solar in Australia is around 179 gigawatts. So that's an order of magnitude greater than the 13, 15 gigawatts of rooftop solar that we have today. And with an annual energy output of 245 terawatt hours, this would be roughly equivalent to our entire national electricity consumption. On the other hand, Bloomberg New Energy Finance has recently forecast that 30% of all energy demand will be supplied by PV and battery systems by 2050, with installed capacity of over 80 gigawatts. Now, we know that forecasts are likely to be wrong, but this just gives you a sense of the scale of what is possible as consumers and businesses take up the energy challenge and install their own systems and seek to reduce emissions and solve their energy cost challenge. So with increasing rates of DER uptake, the challenge is not how much renewable energy we can generate, but how we best integrate this into our system and maximize its value for all energy users. So we now have the pleasure after me of hearing from Kerry Schott. Kerry is the outgoing chair of the Energy Security Board, which recently published the post-2025 market design recommendations, which is a culmination of over 2.5 years of hard work, which has reviewed how rapidly changing technologies in our power system can benefit consumers. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, Kerry, for your years of hard work in chairing the ESB and developing these recommendations. And we look forward to hearing about their implications for DER integration and DEIP. I'd now like to hand over to Craig Chambers to briefly introduce the agenda and then hand to Kerry. Thank you.
Thanks, Darren. So our agenda today is quite a jam-packed one. So we start off with Kerry to talk to the ESB post-2025, and then I'll give a bit of an overview of DEIP and its purpose, what we've achieved to date and what we're looking to achieve. And then we'll hear from the three work streams, the dynamic operating envelopes, interoperability, which is looking at communications and cybersecurity, and the electric vehicle work streams. We'll finish up with a Q&A panel where we will hear from the market bodies and workstream leads in regards to the transitions that are underway and what we're looking to do. And they will be asked to answer your questions through Slido. And as Darren said, we'll put the details up later, but the hashtag handle is DEIP if you'd like to log into that. So I know we were having a bit of challenges getting Kerry on. Do we have her now? If not, we might need to pivot to Phil Blythe.
Thanks, Craig. Well, I'll just make a start while Kerry just joins. I think she's just joining onto the panel group now. So I'll just quickly give a quick synopsis before Kerry joins of the ESB work. As I think everyone knows, the post-2025 program, the final advice has been delivered to energy ministers in July. And that was a pretty comprehensive 300-page document that looked at the way that the energy system can be transitioned over the next 10 years to deal with the rapid change that we're seeing across all parts of the system, both large and small. And distributed energy resources was one of the major 4 streams that played a part of those recommendations.
Phil, I'm here.
Okay, Kerry, you're on. I'll hand over to you.
Sorry.
No problem.
Hi, everyone. Defeated by technology again.
Kerry, we've introduced you and the ESB. We're just now got your slides up and it's over to you to present.
Okay, I think I'm in properly.
We can see you okay.
Okay, good. Thanks, Greg. I'd first of all like to thank everyone who worked with the ESB on our recommendations around DER. And the upshot of that, as everybody knows, was a report that had recommendations in it, which went to energy ministers. And I'm pleased to say that the recommendations in that report were approved by National Cabinet on Friday. The news of that got somewhat lost in some of the political events of Friday, but in fact, those recommendations have been accepted by ministers and we can now move to implementing them. To remind you of what the recommendations were in the distributed energy space. We, as you know, divided them up into intermediate, immediate, get them done now, and initial and longer term reforms. So I might just remind you of what the immediate ones were. They were basically in in 3 areas. The first was the delivery of the DER implementation plan, and ministers have agreed to that plan and to the support of it. The next steps on that are to, in particular, look at the technical standards and guidelines that we need for the kit, along with cyber standards. The maturity plan approach has been adopted, and as you know, that's just a way to manage the change in this area going forward. The development of the two-sided market, and that's already underway with the changes to allow large customers to bid wholesale demand response, and we'll move that down to smaller customers as we go. On the emergency backstop measures, that has been adopted, but I would like to stress that we do see it only as an emergency. It's basically just designed to have AEMO stepping in really only as a last resort, to basically make sure that the system remains stable. There's a number of activities related to that backstop measure, and the first is the much needed rollout of the dynamic operating envelopes, and that work can now start, along with various notices. And the final thing that was adopted is the consumer risk assessment tool, which is largely aimed at consumer protection, but by analysing the risks, we can see where consumers are likely to be most threatened. And the data strategy that we recommended to go with all of these recommendations was supported, but it hasn't been adopted in the detail we had it there yet. It will be, I think, in the next few weeks, but ministers just simply didn't have the time to give to considering it. And there is a lot happening in that field, so senior officials are going to pay more attention to it in coming weeks. And finally, we did note to ministers, and it's pretty much obvious really, that the roles and responsibilities are changing of the people in that area, and our advice did set out the direction and roles and responsibilities of the various actors in this space. Customers, as we know, are changing the way that they relate to the system. We spelt out what you can expect around retailers and aggregated changes to the DNSP responsibilities, changes to AEMO's responsibilities, which are basically some new ones, and again, changes to get more data and strategy. And as we implement some of these things going forward, there'll be a pretty busy time between now and Christmas and then out into next year. And then change will continue going forward. And that's the update that we had for today. Thank you.
Craig, I think we're going to go back to you, but Kerry, if I could just say while I'm online, and I know you're a little bit late joining, so you didn't hear me thank you before, I just wanted to thank you personally for your years of hard work at the ESB in bringing this program of work forward. It's been a mammoth task and you've done just exceptionally well. So just wanted to thank you on behalf of Arena and everyone else.
Well, thanks, Darren. Well, thank everyone for their help with this. It's as we all know, it's a multiple tasked exercise.
Okay, well, thank you, Kerry. Thank you, Darren. And we'll get into the agenda for today. So thanks again to everyone for attending. For those of you who have joined a bit late, this is our agenda for today. The slides will be made available at the end of the presentation today. So we will share those via a link. I'm assuming they'll be on the Arena website. So feel free to listen along. If you could move to the next slide, please. So as Darren said, when we started and co-designed DEIP back in 2018, the challenge was big then, and I think it's fair to say that since then we've seen the challenge even get bigger and more complex. Whether it's expected massive uptake in EVs, companies like SunDrive, graduates from UNSW, doing world-leading breakthroughs on solar cell efficiencies, or the 7-fold reduction in rooftop PV costs over the last 10 years. I think we would all agree that DER in all its forms is continuing to become cheaper, more efficient, and either bigger in scale or in uptake trends. But the challenges are multifaceted in regards to the outcomes that we want from it, whether it's customers wanting greater fairness or sustainability or cost outcomes, whether it's the market bodies or grid operators looking for greater stability and balancing supply demand, or increasing the need for standardization or managing cybersecurity, or whether it's regulators looking to protect customers, improve efficiency, and enable participation and competition in the market. These are all trends and challenges and opportunities that Australia really can't look over its shoulder to any other country globally in regards to how to manage some of these challenges. And so therefore, there is a growing importance of greater collaboration and need for exploration and innovation in some of these areas. Next slide, please. So as Darren said, the DEIP purpose is to maximise the value for all energy users from DER, and by doing that, we're looking to support the reforms, the innovations, the ongoing importance of focus around customer outcomes from the decentralisation of our energy system. And it's these 13 organisations that form the steering group that work regularly to try to chip away at these challenges over time. These organisations also regularly work through the working groups with other stakeholders in the sector. So it's not exclusively these organisations tackling all these challenges. If we go to the next slide, please. So where does DEIP operate? It tends to operate in the sweet spot where collaboration is needed, either where industry, market bodies and consumer groups have a shared interest in an outcome and need to collaborate. And what we're attempted to do is to focus resources around particular challenges that are commonly agreed that need to be overcome in the sector. Some of them are multifaceted, multidisciplinary in priority, and many of them require and are informed by innovation. Next slide, please. So this is how DEIP is structured for those of you that don't actively work with DEIP. So we have a 1-year rolling sprint where we work with the CEOs of the steering group on an annual basis and the organisations that represent them to form the priorities for that year. And we typically try to keep to 3, maybe 4 working groups with a few clear objectives for that year. And although you see an alphabet soup of logos working under each of these working groups, they do actively organise industry or consumer or stakeholder-wide workshops. And there is typically 1 or 2 or 3 organisations doing a lot of the administration and heavy lifting in these working groups. We'll hear from each of these working groups today, and those working groups are really where the rubber hits the road. The Secretariat is the market bodies, ESB and ARENA. We look to support the ongoing coordination, so the facilitation of these events and organising of these events often gets done by the Secretariat. The Secretariat meets on a 3-weekly basis, and the steering group meets on a biannual basis. So we try to inform many of those working groups through either activities going on in the sector, ARENA-funded projects, to make sure that what is being contemplated in the reforms and the standards and the developments in these working groups are grounded to real-world application. We just go to the next slide, please. So what's DEIP achieved? I mean, I personally believe we've achieved a lot more cross-stakeholder collaboration in the distributed energy space. I think when we started in 2018, there was a loose set of relationships, but now there's a very much a direct working relationship with the key stakeholders within the sector, and they actively are informed by, as I said, projects underway in the sector. I'll talk to in a minute the access and pricing reform, which was one of the standouts, but we've also supported things like the New Energy Compact that was developed last year, recently announced the Australian Implementation Guide for the IEEE 2030.5, and also the work that's underway in the electric vehicle and the dynamic operating envelopes areas, which you'll hear about today. Next slide, please. So this is just an case study of how DEIP has supported reform. And reforms come in many shapes and sizes. This is one which culminated in a rule change where back in 2019, we held a workshop with the AEMC looking at how network regulation could support the uptake of DER in the sector. And the conclusion that we struck in that meeting was that the current pricing and access and pricing arrangements did not support investment and equitable outcomes for all energy consumers and users. And so what we did is we worked through a series of meetings and workshops to explore that issue in further detail. And we informed that through specialist and expert reports to be able to inform the conversation. That culminated after just over a year's worth of work in 3 quite similar rule changes submitted to the AEMC in July 2020. And then the traditional rule change process, which Ed will talk to that later today, was probably much more streamlined because of the prior work that was done and the consultation that was done prior to getting to the formal rule change process. So whether you like that reform or not, that was a way in which the sector worked together, consumer groups worked together to really tackle some of these more challenging reforms that are being contemplated by the sector. So with that, I'll hand over to our next speaker. But before I do, if I can just move to the next slide, if I can just remind everyone to again log into Slido and put your questions into Slido. The hashtag DEIP is the handle to get into the Slido, and the questions will be moderated at the end with the panel of speakers, which you'll hear from today. So with that, I'll hand over to Anthony Seipolt to talk a little about the dynamic operating envelopes workstream. Over to you, Anthony.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you to the audience today for coming on. I hope this will be interesting. My name is Anthony Seipold. I'm a consultant working with ARENA and leading the Dynamic Operating Envelope Working Group. I'll be speaking about the working group's achievements for the year, and then handing over to Bryn Williams from South Australia Power Networks to talk about a real-life implementation. Before I do that, I would like to note that I'm on the land of the Warrawurrung in the surf coast of Victoria, and acknowledge their people's past, present, and future, their leaders, and also apologise if there's some background noise, because by a piece of delicious irony, I'm having solar installed today. Well, I didn't know they were coming today, but they are here now, and so there's a bit of background noise there, and I do apologise for that. And it's only 5 kilowatts. I couldn't get any more where I am. More onto that. If we could move to the next slide, please. We've been trying to think for a while about how to present dynamic operating envelopes visually, and talk about how it delivers value to customers. And we're still struggling, and the graph I've got in front of you today is very network centric and doesn't focus on consumer benefits, but it does speak to what we're seeking to do here. And so the graph is what's we call a low duration curve, and it shows the percentage of time during a year, this one, that a network sees a level higher than a particular load. So you can see in this example for South Australia in 2020, it actually reached a peak above 3,000 megawatts for a very short period of time. But you can also look at, and you follow that down, and that was quite a peaky peak. And if you follow that down to the lows and the minimum demands that you may have heard talked about, you can see it also is in those lower areas for a very small period of time. So essentially, we've got a grid that is underutilized for the majority of the year. And so the concept with dynamic operating envelopes is we're going to seek to give consumers access to that underutilized capacity, and only limit access at the very extreme periods of the year, very short periods of time. So that's the working model there. The benefits here obviously are that we're providing consumers with sort of enhanced access to this capacity when the network is unconstrained, but then limiting them when a little bit during those periods of the year when it is constrained. So that in itself is freeing up capacity without it requiring an extension to the network that we would traditionally build to address a constraint. So this allows for more efficient sharing of the network capacity, but also more equitable potentially. There's work to be done in that space to share that spare capacity with all consumers, and thereby reduce costs for all consumers. Certainly will enable more solar energy to get to the market through this model, and Bryn will speak to that, and thereby hopefully reducing prices and certainly reducing emissions. And one of the key benefits as well of the dynamic operating envelope model is it's supporting the communication links that will enable more sophisticated use of DR into the future. And in particular, Lachlan from the ANU will speak to the communication protocols that are emerging in this space. And it also provides a solution to the minimum demand. So in the longer term, the intent here is that this framework will not only support the local distribution network in managing the constraints on their grid, but also support system outcomes to ensure that we're balancing the system in the real time that's necessary. And in the future, if we look into the rollout of electric vehicles, this model will also support flexing up for that, and potentially the managed charging of EVs, and of course the greater access of batteries and in this space as well. And finally, it's probably worth noting that customers in constrained areas will definitely benefit from this, because this will enable constraints to be earlier identified, and therefore, and work being done by the AER will support build out of those constraints. So greater access to consumers where there's an economic benefit there. So I might just move to the next slide. So this is the work plan that essentially that the group has been delivering over the year. We start off the year with 2 workshops, public workshops, that focused on a couple of principles there. They were looking at developing a capacity allocation principles, so the sharing, if you like, and the equity aspects of a dynamic operating envelope. And secondly, then there was a second workshop was looking at the information architecture, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So the working groups, this is a challenging space, and it's hard to communicate with consumers exactly how this plays out and works for them in this space. So we found there was a very strong consumer sentiment towards national consistency in the approach for implementing dynamic operating envelopes, and that was for both imports and exports, interestingly enough. There was a recognition, I think, that consumers, that DOEs will have a significant implication on consumers and their investments and their operating decisions. Obviously, the intent here is that the dynamic operating envelope simply sits as the, if you like, the outer guardrails, just to protect the operation of the grid for all consumers, and that the markets will and consumer access will operate within that framework. But it will impact the decision making of consumers, without a doubt. Consumers were very much in favour of transparency and nationally consistent principles, as I said. And when we looked at the way the operating envelopes would be applied, there was a recognition of both technical efficiency, i.e. just the ability to get us more energy out of this grid, but also some social equity aspirations as well in that space. So that's going to be a part of the conversation as we go forward in delivering these. What I did, at the second part, we currently have a trial going on through a consultant, ENEA, looking at customer energy management systems and seeking to assess the ability of these energy management systems to integrate with dynamic operating envelopes. The early signs coming from that study, and we'll be publishing that in November, are quite positive, in as much that many of these systems in place look like they will have the ability to operate natively or with very little modification with dynamic operating envelopes. And we've looked at a range of models there, range from the existing solar all the way through to home energy management systems in a box, and also cloud-based systems as well. So that's looking positive, but we'll have that report released later this year. And then the last two pieces of work that are ongoing, we have a current consultancy that is soon to be kicked off to gauge the status of the energy networks across Australia in terms of their dynamic operating envelopes, and there is a lot of work going on in this space. So we're just seeking to sort of get a snapshot of where that's at today. And the final piece is we're preparing a white paper for publication later, hopefully early in December, that will talk about the implementation pathways for dynamic operating envelopes from a national perspective. And that's involving all the working group, and then that'll be put out for consultation in December. If we go to the next slide, thanks. I don't want to pretend that this is all operating in isolation within DEIP. DEIP is doing a wonderful job supporting many, many projects in this space, but we need to recognise there's a lot of other parties who are investigating and implementing and have gone beforehand in the communications aspects, everything. So it's a package of works that's highly integrated and dependent, if you like, along with a lot of prior works. I won't go through all of those studies there, but I do recognise there's a lot of work by a lot of people in this space. It's been incredibly valuable. So I hope my background noise hasn't been too bad. With that, I'll pass over to Bryn.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So, yeah, Bryn Williams here from SA Power Networks. I'll just talk to you a little bit about what we're doing here in South Australia. So in South Australia, we're using a technical standard called IEEE 2030.5 to publish dynamic operating envelopes via the internet to customer solar and battery systems. And that's, in practice, that's in the form of a dynamic export limit, or we call it a flexible export limit. So that means that customers with this system can have an export limit that will vary through the day. It will go up and down. It can go up as high as 10 kilowatts. So that's twice as much export capacity as our kind of traditional 5 kilowatt fixed export limit. But it will reduce at those times when the network is congested with too much solar. Next slide, please. So this shows the journey that we've been on. We started bringing our first customers actually onto dynamic export limits back in mid-2019 in our advanced VPP grid integration trial. And that was working with Tesla and battery customers in their virtual power plant. We've got about 1,000 customers that are operating on that scheme today in South Australia. And we've just launched our new flexible exports for solar PV trial. So this is the second stage trial where we're taking this approach. And we're now opening it up for customers who just have regular solar, rooftop solar, not battery or virtual power plant customers. And we're working with leading inverter manufacturers, Fronius, SMA, and Solar Edge, working with Switched-In, which is an Australian technology vendor, and AusNet Services in Victoria. And we see these trials as being kind of a prime example of ARENA funding being used to accelerate the maturity of technology to production. So we've known that we need this capability in South Australia to integrate the levels of solar that we have on our grid here for some time. And we had a program of work approved by the Australian Energy Regulator to develop this capability during the 2020 to 2025 period. And when we put that program of work together, our expectation was that we might be able to bring this online around about 2024. But through the ARENA funding and the trials that we've been able to undertake, we've not only been able to accelerate that significantly to the extent that we actually expect to launch this as a standard connection service in South Australia as early as the middle of next year, but we've also been able to have a much broader conversation nationally with industry through things like the DEIP Working Group and the API Working Group to work together to advance a truly national standards-based approach to this smart way of integrating DER with the grid. Next slide, please. So I'll talk briefly about the trial that we're running. So we began field testing for our new trial back in August with 7 customer sites. We worked with 4 different solar installers. And these customers have a choice of 2 different inverters. So either the Fronius Primo or the GrowWatt inverter shown there. And in this case, we're using the switched-in droplet device, which acts as a local gateway in the home. So this is the thing that provides the customer side of the IEEE 2030.5 interface that talks to us, and it activates this dynamic export limit capability on the inverters. Next slide. And just some statistics from those initial customers for those who are interested. So this is us showing some stats for a single customer over about a 5-week period from mid-August to late September this year. And you can see that even through this period, which is traditionally a period when the network becomes congested with solar because we have lots of sunshine and quite mild weather. For this customer, they've been able to have a 10 kilowatt export limit for 97% of the time. And so this really illustrates the point that Anthony made earlier, that the network does definitely become congested with solar at certain times, but these times are quite few and far between and very short in duration. So if we can move to this dynamic smart approach, we can give customers much more access to the available network capacity the rest of the time. In this case, you might be able to see at the top there that this customer has been able to export something like 272 kilowatt hours more energy over that period than they would have done on the old fixed 5 kilowatt export limit. Next slide, please. So following the field testing, we actually went live with our trial about a week and a half ago on the 24th of September in this orange area here, which is the area of Shadow Park down in the southwestern suburbs of Adelaide. And so as of today, any new customer seeking to connect solar in this area, this is an area that has a lot of solar today, and the network does become congested at certain times. So customers connecting solar in this area today are no longer able to connect a basic 5 kilowatt system or a fixed 5 kilowatt system, but they have a choice of either connecting a 1.5 kilowatt or a system that's statically limited to 1.5 kilowatts, or coming on to the flexible export scheme, which gives them that flexible limit. They can install a larger system and they can export up to 10 kilowatts. So that trial is live now. We're just starting to recruit customers through our normal connection process. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide from me, just to give an indication of the journey that we're on through the remainder of the trial to get us to the stage where we can open this up as a standard business as usual connection option for solar customers across South Australia. And a big part of that is making sure that customers have a rich choice of compatible equipment they can purchase if they want to join this dynamic scheme. So we launched, as I said earlier, with 2 inverter options for customers activated via the switched-in gateway device, the Fronius Primo and the GrowWatt. In the next couple of weeks, we'll be bringing on another 3 inverter options, SMA Sunny Boy, an ABB inverter, and another Fronius model, also activated via the gateway. And then by the time we get to mid-January, our partners in the trial will be offering inverter products that don't require any gateway at all, where the functionality is just integrated within the inverter. So from the customer perspective, there's really no difference then to the kind of products they would have installed before we moved to flexible exports. They simply buy a compatible inverter, install it, and it will enroll in the scheme and operate dynamically. So that's it for me. Thanks,
Bryn and Anthony. So if I can just remind everyone to keep putting your questions into Slido. I'm going to send it through a few in while we're waiting for people to put their questions in. But I think the one burning thing for me is directed to probably you, Bryn, to start off. You appear to be a little bit further ahead than a few other utilities, maybe because you've got more pressing challenges in South Australia. Other utilities are obviously looking down the barrel of and watching probably very closely to what you're doing. How do you think that we need to roll this out so that it is somewhat nationally consistent, easy for customers, easy for suppliers in the medium term?
Yeah, I think the sort of efforts that Anthony talked about that DEIP is coordinating are key to that. I think open standards is probably the biggest thing for us. So the work that's been done on standardizing IEEE 2030.5, the protocol we use to talk to smart inverters and smart systems nationally through the national working group that's been working on this for more than 18 months now. I think that's absolutely key, because even though we have pressing needs in South Australia, we were committed to moving forward with this, with making this capability available in South Australia. Without a national approach, it's very difficult to get the whole of the inverter industry to come along the journey and to make sure that customers have that rich choice of different products and systems. You don't want a state-specific solution. You absolutely want a national solution. So,
and I think adding on to that, what we've heard from the consumer workshops very strongly was the need for national sort of standardization, harmonization. I think there's also an aspect of trust needed in this space as well. So I think the work that there was a rule, access and pricing rule changes identified a need for the AER to monitor exports by the networks. And I think we'll need to ensure some format in the future where we capture export performance under dynamic operating envelopes, and reporting of that, or even the inclusion of that in an incentive scheme, will be a great way to ensure or improve customer trust and visibility of the outcomes as well. And I think there's also a process where we look at the connection agreements that each network has with the consumer. So when you install your new piece of DER, you sign up to one of these connection agreements. I think, as sort of Bryn was leading to, there's probably a national consistency aspect there, particularly in the standards and protocols and the way those things are developed. So there's probably an open question, I think, in how much we standardize and look to make those consistent across the national market.
Okay. I might pick up one of the questions in the slide in regards to customers. So this interface appears to be with the switched-in droplet or the inverter and the network. What conversation have you had with the customer, and how are these systems working with customers' expectations and consultations through these reforms?
Yeah, obviously that's critically important for us, and that's developing the right way to have the conversation with customers to explain what the connection offer is and how it works and what the benefits are has been a key part of the work we've been doing in the lead up to launching our trial. So we've been working with consultants and customers, focus groups and so forth in the solar industry to build that conversation and to understand the best way to talk to customers about this. And I think it's been generally very well received. One of the learnings for us, I think, of course, is that, you know, we're a distribution network. Our job is to make available the services that we can to give customers the best access to the network. But the customer's first port of call when they're installing solar or a battery is not ourselves, it's their solar provider or their retailer or whoever they go through. And so it's been very important for us to educate and engage with the solar industry, perhaps even more so than directly with customers, because they're the people who will be the customers. They will be the people who are advocating for and explaining these services to customers and explain the options that customers have available to them. So it's really important that we're engaged broadly across the solar industry, and we've had some very good support and good engagement from the solar industry through this process.
Thanks. Yeah. And I think as we move into a model where we see electric vehicles, home storage, and PV being integrated together, it's going to be necessary to see the bundle. There'll be product. We're assuming there'll be product bundles that come out from retailers, aggregators, VPPs, etc., that will intrinsically make use of the dynamic operating envelope model, because that's the only way that the consumer can get value from these products. So, yeah, it's important that we engage with the industry. Do also note the work the ECA has been doing on the DOE working group there as well. Sorry about the background noise.
Okay, all right. Well, I know there's a number of other questions in here. I think one has been highly voted, and I'll just let that slip through, and then we're going to have to move on. And it's probably directed to both of you. So it's a question around the calculation of operating envelopes and the fact that, you know, perfect visibility isn't a reality for distribution networks, probably other than Victoria. What do you think needs to be done to overcome this challenge?
I'll maybe have a quick go first. So I think the first thing to note is, yeah, absolutely, we don't have perfect visibility. So we can't perfectly tune the operating envelopes as much as we'd like to do. But the first thing to note is that actually just moving from a fixed limit to a dynamic limit gives you tremendous benefit straight away, even if that dynamic limit isn't quite up at the very top end of where it could be at all times, because you have to be a bit conservative because you don't quite have the visibility you'd like. There's such a huge leap in benefit for customers just activating that dynamic nature, even if the calculation is relatively simplistic. So the main thing is to get the service up and running and make sure it's available to customers to use, and then we can incrementally improve the accuracy and the capability of our dynamic operating envelope calculation engine behind the scenes, and that just gradually creeps up the amount of capacity we can make available to customers. So absolutely, we need more visibility. We're doing a bunch of work in that area and improving the way we can model our network and calculate those operating envelopes behind the scenes. So yes, things like smart meter data will be absolutely key in future to networks, to achieving, or networks outside of Victoria, to achieving the visibility that we need to maximise the benefits of these schemes.
Yeah, I think Bryn's just pointed out a beautiful case file. The networks across Australia have been getting smarter and smarter over the years as more technology is deployed at the lower levels, voltage levels of the networks. And some recent updates by the AER, the VEDA study has provided opportunities by which the networks can actually show value by deployment of increasing levels of technology, and therefore support more accurate dynamic operating envelopes going forward. And the conversely, as we have seen from the customer conversations, there's a need to discuss social equity in these allocations. They can't just, we don't believe they're going to be purely technical in application. So the deployment will get more and more, the abilities will get more and more complex, but we'll also need to manage them within the customer expectation framework.
Okay, well, thanks, and we'll hear from you, Anthony, on the panel, so I appreciate that. If everyone can continue to add in your questions to Slido, and you can vote on those on the platform. So with that, I'll hand over to Lachlan Blackall, who's leading on the Interoperability Steering Group activities. Lachlan, are you there?
I am. Thanks very much, Craig. Oh, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome along to the public forum today. As Craig said, my name's Lachlan Blackall. My day job is that I head up the battery storage and grid integration program at the Australian National University, but a real pleasure to be here today wearing my other hat, which is as the independent chair of the Interoperability Steering Committee. So before I begin, please allow me to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, which for me in the ACT is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Could we go to the next slide, please? As is suggested by the name, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the sort of interoperability in the broad, which will also touch on some of the cybersecurity elements of the work that we're doing. I think before we sort of dive into the details, it's probably worth stepping back a little bit to explain what we mean by interoperability. And I'm actually going to use, going to build on what Bryn was talking about in his presentation. So, if we go back, a decade or so, when we started to install solar, we were very concerned about electrical interoperability. So we have standards, electrical standards about, how inverters, both for solar and now increasingly for batteries, were able to connect in an electrical sense to our electricity system. Sort of coming forward, we've now increasingly realize the value that comes from being able to communicate with these devices, both solar, battery storage in an increasing way, and obviously electric vehicles into the future. And so now we're thinking about interoperability as it pertains to these communication standards and our ability to communicate and share data both, to and from these DER devices. So we need standards to ensure that we can actually send data, but with the data that we send, we also need to understand what it is that we're actually sending and what that data means. And so, when we're thinking about dynamic operating envelopes, that's a particular case that is enabled through interoperability standards. We have the ability to share data and the devices understand what that data means as it pertains to setting dynamic operating envelopes. So within the Interoperability Steering Committee, we're looking at these questions of interoperability in the broad. So we're looking to provide the underpinning communications, pardon me, the underpinning communications and the standards that will allow us to exchange and to use data effectively. And this will be both for, initial uses like dynamic operating envelopes with solar, but much more broadly, we're thinking about interoperability standards that will allow us to communicate and exchange data with, all of the devices that are increasingly being connected to our distribution network. So if you think about, the projections around how much DER we're going to have in our grid, we start to realize, obviously, that being able to communicate and share data with and then use that for the purposes of orchestration is really going to be fundamental to ensuring that we can maintain energy reliability and energy security within the electricity system. And so, the goal of interoperability is really to allow these DER devices being able to be first-class participants in the operation of the grid going forward. Now, the benefits of this are, quite significant. Bryn's already talked about the ability to, to better utilize existing infrastructure in smarter ways, but through orchestration, which will be enabled by interoperability, we're also unlocking ways that DER can participate in markets for energy and ancillary services and network services over time. Ultimately, this stands to directly benefit consumers, hopefully reducing costs and further increasing the uptake of DER. And so by getting interoperability right, we ultimately give customers choice and certainty about their uptake of DER. And I think that's, a fantastic outcome that we can all be pleased to be heading towards. So in terms of the Interoperability Steering Committee, it's been around in several forms since it was first started in May 2020. And over that time, it's played a role in establishing other key working groups and working alongside other key working groups. And we've obviously had some good wins recently with the publication of the Common Smart Inverter Profile Australia. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So working alongside the Interoperability Steering Committee, we also have the DER Integration API Technical Working Group. It's a bit of a mouthful. The acronym's even worse. And more recently, we've just started up the Cyber Working Group. And so within these working groups, we're seeing significant amount of standards development being undertaken. And I'd really like to thank all of the people and organisations who donate time to participate in these working groups. So all of the working groups, including the Interoperability Steering Committee, we've got a terms of reference, work plans, and membership. And the membership, particularly for the API working group and the Cyber Working Group, is evolving over time, particularly as we respond to emerging needs for standards development. So over this time, probably the key outcome that we've had has been the publication of what we call the CCIP Australia, which is otherwise known as the Australian Implementation Guide for IEEE 2030.5. And Bryn mentioned this in the context of the trials that have been running in South Australia, and it will underpin the rollout of the long-term capabilities in that state and elsewhere in Australia. So I've provided the link here on this slide, and certainly would encourage you, if you are working in this space, to dive in and have a look at what has been achieved in publishing this CCIP Australia document. This really means now that we have a nationally consistent way of providing DER visibility and also enabling dynamic operating envelopes. Can we move to the next slide, please? So just to give you sort of a brief insight into where we're going from here, obviously it's fantastic to see CCIP Australia now being published and being used. There's also significant work underway, though, to actually take this document and convert it into more fully fledged standard documentation. So the first part of that will be to publish it as a Standards Australia handbook, and we're working very closely with Standards Australia to do that in the coming months, and our thanks for all of their help and support with that. Once you have a standard, that's fantastic, but you also need to be able to verify that devices are compliant with that standard. And so the API working group is leading the development of testing guide and use cases and data that will support vendors being able to ensure that they are compliant and compatible with the standard. We're also working directly with the IEEE, which is a US-based organisation, to ensure that the extensions that are being developed here in Australia, which at this point primarily relate to dynamic operating envelopes, can actually be incorporated into the base IEEE 2030.5 standard. Beyond the work this year and early next, also have got a key focus on how we enable interoperability for electric vehicles. And you'll hear a little bit more about the EV workstream coming up next. So I've talked a lot about interoperability standards so far, but a key part of that is also ensuring that we have cybersecurity. And so, cybersecurity really relates to ensuring that only the authorized people are able to communicate and to interact with systems with the network systems, and also with systems being run by the system operator, AEMO. So this work is really just kicking off, but so far we've formed a cyber working group and are working really, really closely with federal and state departments and organisations. And there's an emerging focus on this, obviously, that has occurred as a consequence of the ESB recommendations. And so that's been a really great step forward in getting a focus on cybersecurity. So there's a a significant technical work plan that's being developed at the moment alongside the ESB and the market and regulatory bodies. And it's really interesting to see, industry queries being raised around, particular implementation activities for cybersecurity. And so thinking about the, how we ensure cybersecurity for example, IEEE 2030.5 is obviously a key focus. Could we move to the next slide, please? So really just to provide a snapshot of, the projects that are working and leveraging these standards, you can see a list here of ARENA funded projects. Once again, I think it's worthwhile and important to thank all of the people and organisations who are involved in these projects, who again are contributing to the operation of the DEIP Interoperability Steering Committee, but also to the API Working Group and to the emerging Cyber Working Group. One of the most significant benefits, I think, from the DEIP activities is that it brings together so many people and organisations to solve problems that are of common interest and importance. And while standards might not feel like the most exciting area to be working in, the absence of standard makes it almost impossible for us to adopt DER at scale into the future. And so this is really important foundational work that's been enabled through the participation of these organisations. So it gives me great pleasure now to hand over to Bill Tarleton, who's Managing Director of Zeppelin, who's going to talk about one particular project, the Evolve project, and to focus a little bit more on the role that standards has played in that project, but also in supporting the at-scale adoption of DER. Thanks very much, Bill.
Thanks, Lachlan. As Lachlan said, I'm with Zeppelin. We're technology providers in the electricity distribution sector, and we have a focus on software systems development and electrical network modelling. I'll be building on the material so far presented by Lachlan, Bryn and Anthony, and I'm going to start by talking about the innovation standardisation cycle. So as we all know, over the last 5 years, there's been a lot of activity in various trials, projects and pilots to identify the best ways to integrate renewables and distributed energy resources into the electricity system. There's been a lot of innovation going on. And the Evolve project, which I'll talk about shortly, is one of several initiatives currently in flight. But innovation projects by themselves don't change business as usual without adoption. So how do we drive adoption? Well, the answer is through standardisation. Standardisation results in complex systems just working. And when things just work, people start using them. This webinar is possible because we're communicating in a standard called the English language. Every time you plug a USB device in your laptop, swipe your credit card, or use the internet, you're benefiting from the widespread adoption of standards. By standardising at the right point in the innovation cycle, we'll capture the value of the innovation that's gone before, and we'll be able to direct it into business outcomes and customer benefits. If we don't standardise, we get stuck in the proof of concept mode. And we think now is the right time for the rubber to hit the road as far as standardisation goes. And as others have pointed out before, this needs to be at a national level. Now, for standards to be adopted, there needs to be collaboration between actors in the problem space. DEIP is providing an important forum for this collaboration to take place in Australia. The Evolve project interacts with the DEIP through our involvement in DEIP facilitated activities, and the DEIP's informed by and informs real-world projects such as Evolve. Could I go to the next slide? So a little bit about the Evolve project. It's been delivered through a consortium of 10 organisations. We're the lead body, and we have 4 DNSPs from New South Wales and Queensland, 4 aggregators, and the Australian National University, the ANU, as our academic partner. The project's received funding from both ARENA and the New South Wales governments, and we're now in the final 6 months of what's been a 3-year project. Basic concept behind the project is pretty simple. Some years ago, it was recognised that rooftop PV was creating technical problems for networks, and we all believe that the adoption of electric vehicles and changing mixes of consumption through the longer term move from gas to electricity for heating will further stress the networks. Now, the networks need to work all the time, 24/7. But as Anthony and Bryn have already explained very well, the technical issues caused by these changing consumption and generation patterns only happen infrequently. Most of the time, the networks will have the capacity needed to host these new so-called DER assets. So our concept with the Evolve project was to develop the technologies and algorithms needed to shape the behaviour of the DER for those times when that behaviour, if unmanaged, would damage assets. In order to deliver what we called operating envelopes to achieve this outcome, we adopted the IEEE 2030.5 standard, same standard that has been used for the South Australian rollout, as the transport protocol, and we based the data platform needed to support the algorithms on what is known as the IEC Common Information Model, or the SIM. Next slide, please. So although the Evolve project objective can be stated relatively simply, achieving that simple outcome to work at scale has resulted in the development of an iceberg-like technology stack and something we're calling the Evolve platform now. Most of it's open source. There's over 41 separate code repositories, and we have at the moment 18 active developers contributing to that code base. We think platforms like Evolve are important because the software systems needed to support higher penetration DER at scale are really complex, and we need ways of managing that complexity. What we've done is identified several subsystems that are needed specifically for our problem space to support research outcomes, as well as the development of new application software. And we've turned these into reusable open source components. We've used the IEC SIM, the Common Information Model, as a standard to underpin our data model and encourage reuse and broad level contributions from the software development community, and to admit a range of technology providers to the solution space. Our hope is that the software systems we've developed through the Evolve project will help research outcomes to be accelerated and will facilitate the development of new application software by DNSPs and their technology partners, including ourselves. I think we'd all like to see a vibrant domestic technology development ecosystem to support the widespread adoption of DER and renewables. DEIP's helping us to contribute to this by facilitating working groups and providing forums such as this to communicate our vision. Okay, that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Bill and Lachlan. So just in the interest of time, I might just take one question and then we can follow up with additional ones in the panel. The question that's got the most votes here is just in relation to IEEE 2030.5 being an inverter control standard. And the question is asking, how do we activate flexible load in a two-sided market?
Yeah, great question. I mean, probably just to sort of just step back a bit. I mean, the 2030.5 standard was originally focused as being a utility to device standard, but it does actually allow utility to aggregator functions as well. And so that, the standard is becoming increasingly flexible in terms of how it, potentially can support flexibility. It does have the ability to send significant amounts of other information, pricing information, which might be used to offer incentives. Outside of, this work around, access and pricing is leading to work around how we think about, tariff structure incentives, which again are, they're very compatible with the concept of dynamic operating envelopes, and again, can be communicated through the standard. So once we have standards, we have a bit of a Swiss Army knife in terms of how we approach these problems. One of the reasons, though, why we think about having, an Australian implementation guide is so that we know how we will use the standard to enable that flexibility, for example, in the Australian context.
Okay, so there was a question just directly to you, Bill. You talk about now's the right time for standards. Which standards were you referring to?
Well, in this case, the IEEE 2030.5 standard specifically, I suppose. But the SIM, the Common Information Model, has actually been around for a long time, and a lot of attempts have been made to sort of leverage it and to build it into platforms that can be used by a broad community of developers. It's been difficult to achieve that, and I think we're seeing now a need for a lot of new software development, a lot of legacy software that is becoming brittle and old. And if we have a need for developing a lot of new software, now is a good time to start thinking about trying to standardize on some of the common, the model of the network, the digital twin, if I can use that expression, that represents the electrical network model, so that we've at least got the opportunity for more collaboration, more cooperation between technology developers.
Okay, well, thanks, gentlemen, for your informative presentations. We'll have opportunities for more questions in the panel at the end. So with that, I will move on to Kate O'Callaghan, who is leading the EV grid integration workstream. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Craig. So my name is Kate O'Callaghan. I'm the director of the knowledge sharing team here at ARENA and now heading up the DEIP EV grid integration workstream. So today I'm going to kick off with a little bit of context on why DEIP is focusing on EVs. So if we can move through to the next slide. Really, a lot of it is about that increased demand that's coming through from EVs. So EVs are predicted to be the fastest growing demand category in the NEM from the mid-2020s, which is really not that far away. EV demand is forecast to add upwards of a terawatt hour of new consumption each year from the late 2020s. And by the time we get through to 2050, we think that's going to be approaching the level of total residential consumption. So that's a lot of new demand coming down the line. Spatial distribution of EV demand is not going to be uniform across Australia. It's obviously going to be quite lumpy, and hosting capacity issues will occur in some DNSPs faster than others. So that's an added complexity as well. And I also kind of wanted to point out that I guess, why did we separate out this form of DER from all the other forms of DER that we talk about in DEIP? I guess EVs are DER but different. We haven't really dealt with mobile DER sources before, so that adds quite a bit of complexity to the conversation about where demand will happen, and those patterns won't necessarily be static over time, they might change. And of course, as well, EVs are primarily viewed by the person who invested in that asset as a transport asset, at least at the moment anyway. So anything that we need to do around grid integration needs to be pretty consistent with the way that the customer wants to use their asset. So the next years we see are very critical as putting in place initiatives that help to avoid that material increase in peak load. That's the big thing we want to avoid, and maximise the potential for EVs for consumers. We have an opportunity to investigate and test those solutions now, and that's what we're trying to do through the DEIP work before we've got that widespread EV uptake, like we saw with the widespread air conditioning uptake and the widespread solar PV uptake. We're just getting in before that all happens. So moving through to as the purpose of the EV grid integration workstream, and why we established this workstream. So really 4 things. We wanted to facilitate efficient integration of EVs into existing networks and markets. We wanted a forum for industry and government stakeholders to collaborate and coordinate activities. This is about approaching EVs from an energy sector perspective, but with some of our transport colleagues on board as well. And of course, as I was talking about earlier, it's promoting policy and regulatory development before that wide-scale adoption of EVs begins. I get just a little note on the scope of our work. Where grid integration means, we're focusing on initiatives that help us prepare for that increased EV penetration, rather than initiatives looking at how we increase the uptake of EVs. They're happening through different forums. So I really wanted to focus today's discussion on progress to date and what the EV grid integration workstream has been up to. So far, there have been 3 main topics that have been explored through task forces led by AEMO and the EV Council. And I wanted to pause there and do a big shout out to Chris Mock and Larissa Cassidy for their leadership in those task forces. And of course, everyone who participated in those task forces. As Lachlan said, it's people donating their time and their expertise throughout these processes that give us really great outcomes, and we're very thankful for all the work that people have put in. So the first task force to talk about was the EV Data Availability Task Force. So that was stood up to assess EV data availability and requirements to enable the effective integration of EVs from a data perspective. We've got detailed outcome reports on these, but I'll just mention a few things that came out of that one. They identified that EVSE standing and operational data, as well as vehicle standing data, were the most immediate data needs for understanding integration. And they formed consensus on 4 recommendations for coordinating data across industry, including development of EVSE and vehicle registers. So if anyone's interested in learning more on EV data availability, I'd encourage you to go onto AEMO's website or ARENA's website and have a look at the outcomes report there. The second major topic that the group dived into was vehicle grid integration standards. So they conducted a gap analysis of the standards landscape, and they developed a catalogue of international standards that may be candidates for adoption or modification here in Australia. They focused on charging interoperability, energy and services market integration, and disturbance performance and grid support services. Now that the specifics of EV standards have been explored in detail and documented through that outcomes report, this work has been taken up through the broader interoperability DEIP workstream led by Lachlan, as he mentioned earlier. So there's a good crossover between the two there. The third task force I wanted to talk about was the DEIP EV Residential and Incentives Task Force. And they sought to identify opportunities for tariff design that accommodates EVs in the Australian electricity system. They agreed that demand management has potential to complement tariff design in managing EV demand, and they didn't reach a consensus that a specific EV tariff was required, but we'll look to revisit that in a year's time after the demand management trials are over. They developed some guiding principles for exploration of new questions to be explored relating to minimum regulatory technical standards to optimise demand management. So very much the theme was about how do you integrate tariffs and demand management to manage these cars and implement smart charging. So you can find the outcomes from the reports on the website, as I mentioned. And more recently, the workstream has established a new EV grid integration reference group. So that brings together all of the participants from these task forces, which is quite a lot of people, monthly, to share information and test ideas about grid integration initiatives. So we've got this body of knowledge from those 3 task forces and a regular knowledge sharing group up and running. This workstream is at a bit of a reset point at the moment. So work is underway to develop a new work plan with updated priorities to explore. And I think this network or collection of very knowledgeable people helps us to inform what we do next. New research, like the work that Race from 2030 are doing, helps us inform what we do next. And of course, the learning from real world trials help us to inform what we're doing next. So with that, I just wanted to give a small overview of ARENA's portfolio of smart charging projects. So they're a pretty key input to this work stream, and the project leads who've been implementing these trials have been already bringing their knowledge to the task forces as they've been developing up their outcome reports and bringing their knowledge into the reference group, which has been fantastic. We have time to quickly highlight one of these projects today. So I'd like to introduce Rob Colson from AGL, who's going to talk about their smart charging hardware and software trial. You ready to go, Rob?
I am, Kate. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. This morning, I'll give you a very quick overview of what the AGL EV Orchestration trial is and how it fits in with DEIP. Next slide, thanks, Jordan. Firstly, what is the trial? If you look at the little graph on the right-hand side of the slide, you see a curve for unconstrained or unincentivized EV charging of a group of chargers, and you can see a very steep peak in the evening, which is exactly when we don't want a steep peak for system stability and capacity reasons. So we're attempting to see what we can do to better utilise this EV charging load to and to mitigate this peak in the evening. The way we're doing it is threefold. We have an investigation using smart chargers installed in people's homes. This is a residential only trial, I should point out at the beginning. And we have 200 smart chargers being installed in people's homes at the moment to undertake this sort of monitoring and control. We're also doing some technology trialling with new technologies, being vehicle API integration, which is the control of charging through the vehicle rather than through a smart charger, and also vehicle to grid charging. And we have 50 customers on each of those technologies. And last but not least, we are going to compare the performance of those technology controls, if you like, of EV charging with people that are incentivized just based on a time of use pricing signal. So we have a control group of customers with EV charging at home who are on a time of use control group, and we'll use them as a comparison throughout the trial. Next slide, thanks, Jordan. The trial, basically 2.5 years long. We are well advanced now in the recruit and build phase 1 of the trial. We have all of our vehicle API software built and our customers recruited to that. We have just about finished the smart charger installations. We have all of the customers recruited for smart chargers, and we have the software built for that. The vehicle grid's running a little behind schedule at the moment, but everything else is actually a little bit ahead of schedule, which is good. During the course of calendar year 2022, we do all the field testing, and we have a number of test scenarios that we want to utilise and see how that works. There's a lot of customer research in this trial, so we're very keen to understand what customers' response is to the things we're doing, how customers feel about it. We don't want to affect the amenity of their car. Kate mentioned this earlier. These are cars. They're not DER resources that are bolted to the side of a house for DER purposes. They're actually primarily for something else, and we don't ever want to negatively impact the amenity of the vehicle. So we'll be doing a lot of customer research, and I've already done quite a bit on how all this is sitting with customers to make sure that what we end up with is something that will be accepted widely. And in the last phase of the trial, in the first half of 2023, we basically write the big arena report and transition the participants away from the trial. And here's a call out, please go to our arena website for this particular project, and you can see the first report already up. The second one will be going up, I think, probably in the course of the next few weeks, so look out for that one. Next slide, George. We have a number of partners working with us on this trial. On the technology side, on the right, well-known participants in the EV space in Australia, JetCharge and ChargeFox, are providing us with the hardware and the majority of the software for the project. On the vehicle API side, we're using a small startup American company called Flex Charging, who've done quite a bit of work on this in the US. This is their first offshore exercise, so they're providing us the vehicle API interfaces and control for using the vehicle telemetry to control charging. We're also working with some DNSPs, you see them there, who are assisting us in designing the test program and some of the more tricky aspects of network connection, in particular the vehicle to grid chargers, which is a new thing to connect to networks. So we've probably got some quite a bit of work to do to get that operating smoothly. And we understand, of course, that EV charging is potentially quite a challenging load for networks, and so we'll be providing the networks a lot of feedback as we go through on what sort of results we're getting with our test program. Next slide, Jordan. So these are the sort of outcomes we're looking for from this trial. There's a lot of words on this slide, probably too much to go through in the limited time I have available. But if you look at the energy system outcomes, we have seen DEIP as a body which we think we can provide a lot of input into from what we are seeing in this trial. So I think what we find from the technical aspects of the trial, from the sort of availability and loads that we're seeing that we're able to move around, and from the customer research that we're doing, we'll be able to provide quite a bit of input into DEIP to hopefully utilise in the rest of the discussions that are going on in the DEIP forum. So that's really the trial in a nutshell, I think. I think I'm pretty well out of time there, Kate, so I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Rob and Kate, for that. So we'll just a few questions for you. Rob, I think you touched on this, and Kate, you did also. The challenge of convenience of a car that we all need in our kind of modern lives, with the coincidence of everyone charging at the same time, and that being an infrastructure issue. How do you see us overcoming that challenge, noting that we're probably not the only ones in the world dealing with this issue?
Do you want me to take that, Kate?
I'm happy to jump in and throw to you, Rob. I'll go with some generalizations, yep, and I reckon you'll have some specifics. Really, I think the future that we're looking for is that, yes, maybe everyone plugs in their car at the end of the day at the same time, but they don't actually all charge at that time. And that's why we're investigating smart charging options. I think those options need to be easy, almost seamless for the customers. They need to present them with some real value, especially if they're going to invest in charging infrastructure. And I think some of the work that you're doing, Rob, on the software charging is a really interesting space to head into, because potentially the customer doesn't need to invest a lot of money in the charging infrastructure at home. We know that most people in Australia, and even in a lot of overseas countries as well, are quite happy to just charge their car off a regular plug. And why wouldn't they? That's the most sort of convenient and cost-effective thing for them right now. So it's about putting in something as convenient, as cost-effective, and that presents real value for them, whether it's through the hardware or through the software. What do you think, Rob?
So another point that I'd like to make, Kate and Craig, one of the things that came through very strongly on our customer research that we did before starting the trial, and the stuff we've done in the last few months, has been the request by customers to have an override capability. So this comes through very, very strongly on the research. Customers say, look, we're quite happy with you controlling our charger. We don't see a problem, but we can see circumstances where we'd like to get that control back, and where we need the vehicle. It might be an unusual circumstance we have on this day. It's not the way we usually use it, but we must have override capability. So what we've done in the app that we've developed for this trial with ChargeFox is put that override capability in there, so customers can feel comfortable that they ultimately have, the ultimate control, even though they're giving it to us for most of the time. We think they'll use it quite rarely, and it's one of the things we really want to measure in the trial. How much is this actually used? But it's very important for customers to understand that they have that capability at the end of the day. They can turn off the control charging, they can seize control of the charger themselves and charge their car.
Okay. Rob, there was just another question before we go to the panel. The questioner asks, you're looking at bi-directional chargers. Have these been installed yet?
No, they haven't. There's been something of a delay with bi-directional chargers. I think this is sort of generally known around the industry. There are very few bi-directional chargers available in the world, and they've generally only been built for trials, so they're not really in production. They're short-run sort of pre-production units, if I could describe it as that. In Australia, we have some unique requirements to connect a grid-connected inverter onto the network, being AS 4777.2. So the chargers have had to go through a validation process to comply with AS 4777.2, which has required some design changes internally to the chargers. That's now been achieved, so that certification is now exists. And the chargers are, as we speak, going through the CEC accreditation process, which is a prerequisite that most DNSPs have to connect to the network. So we believe we'll be rolling out these chargers in the next 3, maybe 4 months, is what we understand at the moment.
Okay. All right. Well, just in the interest of time, I know we haven't been able to get to all the questions, but we will get those questions through to you, Rob and Kate, to address in the working groups, similarly for the other presenters. So with that, I might pivot to the panel, and just to introduce the panel today, we have a cross-section of people that are very well versed in the reforms undergoing in the DR space. So we have Ed Chan from the AMC, Matthew Armitage from the AEMO, Mark Feather, AER, and Phil Blythe from the ESB. And the presenters that you've just heard from, Anthony, Kate, and Lachlan, will also be on the panel. So do we have all the panelists online now? Yes. So I might go directly to the market bodies and ESB and ask you a question in regards to how do you think we're going in regards to getting ready for the amount of DR we have now and due to have in the future? And what do you think needs to be done, if you don't agree, to accelerate that? I might hand to you, Ed, to start.
Thanks, Craig. For those I've met, I'm the policy director at the AEMC, and I've been involved in quite a number of DER reforms over the last few years. I think it's fair to say that DER is coming. It's not going to stop. It doesn't matter what you're trying to do to it. Customers will always want to install DER some form or another. The challenge is probably anticipating what that DER is going to be and how we can actually have not just a regulatory framework, but generally how the industry as a whole, like all of us working together, can make sure that all of that new assets can be part of a well-functioning electricity system and not create sort of the spikes that many of our previous speakers talked about in air conditioning, PV, and so on. So that will be a key focus from a rulemaker point of view. The ESB, as Kerry said before, report had a number of tasks that we need to get on with. So one of our priority at the AEMC is to implement those recommendations, but also just generally keep an eye out on how we integrate DER in the future. And the key to this is really working with not just the market bodies, but across the sector.
Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I mean, look, from an AR perspective, we see a massive benefit from DER being optimized from a deployment investment perspective, so that you can get aggregated, orchestrated DER that can help provide system services, network services, wholesale market services. So we're fully supportive of this, and we are engaged in multiple work strands, as many of you on the call would know, in relation to DER. One of the things I just wanted to touch on, though, which is a real focus for the AER and has been a focus through the NEM 2025 project, is really the consumer piece. We're moving from a highly centralised system to a more decentralised system there's going to be reliant on 3 million households and growing who have DER and their behaviours. And so, as we move to a framework where there's greater degrees of orchestration, there must be adequate and really good consultation with customers and consumers. There needs to be trust built up with consumers. There needs to be inclusive designs and robust consumer protection arrangements that support this. Because if we don't do that, then we run the risk of, I think, having a lot of great technical ideas, but ideas that are never implemented because we haven't built up the trust and the politicians don't buy into it. So I think as we move along this journey, getting the consumer buy-in is going to be really important.
I might leave you to the last word, Phil. So Matt, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Craig. Yeah, completely agree with Ed and Mark that there's an enormous amount of work to do. If you think about the scale of DER uptake and installations that are to come, it's in the gigawatt scale. And if you think about the level of industry work and collaboration that goes across the industry in integrating large-scale renewables, we have to do something of equivalent scale when it comes to DER integration. And the good news is that I think the DEIP is a really effective forum to facilitate that collaboration. And so I think it's a really valuable tool to help the industry get there. And with the ESB DER implementation plan, again, that's a really good kind of roadmap for the future that can guide us. Just really keen to get into the detail with the industry and really get into the nuts and bolts of how we integrate DER effectively in a transparent and collaborative way across the industry.
Yeah, just to add to everyone's comments, obviously the ESB has been very much a proponent of getting things moving as soon as we can. I think it's been probably the key thing that's come out of the 2025 work is both in terms of the benefits for the system and for customers. Out of all the work streams, DER has come out as one of the areas where there's the most benefits to come from doing a good job in this space. So, this is moving DERs from being a sort of an afterthought in the system to being actually, this is where all the value is going to come from in the next 5 to 10 years. So that's a pretty big shift. And I think the ministerial support for moving this work forward is really, really should shine a spotlight on that. The other issue is just time. We're installing 3 gigawatts of solar, not to mention EVs and storage at a pretty rapid rate. We don't have that long to get these systems in place to ensure that we do have the system operating efficiently and we're not unduly constraining off customers. So I think there is a real impetus in terms of time to make sure that we coordinate across all the market bodies, across industry, with all the great work that DEIP is doing. But just make sure we keep our eyes focused on getting all the way through to implementation, so that we can see the value realised as per Mark's comments.
Okay, so if I could just remind everyone to keep putting your questions into Slido, and I'll do my best to mediate those and fire them into the panel. So while we're waiting for that, a question that sparked my interest was this these trade-off questions in regards to equity or fairness with price, with consumer protections. How does the panel feel that we need to balance some of these things, because they are vexing issues, and difference of perspective can skew what people believe should be the outcome. Given this is largely led by consumers and not market participants in regards to licensed generators or networks in the NEM. How do you feel that we overcome some of those challenges? And I might direct that to you, Mark, because I think you raised this as an issue.
Yeah, I think this kind of has revealed itself somewhat through the DER access and pricing rule change, hasn't it? There's the issues of equity and efficiency, and I think that the AMCs reached a good position. We've been very supportive of the access and pricing rule change proposals, and I think in many senses that they bring the equity and efficiency concepts together in some ways, because it effectively delivered, more cost-reflective pricing, whether it be for imports of solar or exports of solar, ultimately should drive better investment decisions in the poles and the wires. And if we're doing that, that should reduce cost to all customers. But at the same time, targeting some of the costs to the extent that exporters are imposing cost, targeting some of those costs through good pricing signals. So I think at a high level, the equity and efficiency piece does come together through whether it's export pricing or whether it's through long-standing support for network tariff reform. And a lot of this is about trying to, if you look at the network tariff reform piece as well, it's trying to smooth that duck curve in a way. So, unless you smooth the duck curve, there will be higher costs put onto all customers. And how do we smooth that and create the right behaviours and the right investment framework?
I think, Anthony, you had your hand up next.
Yeah, I just thought I'd throw in a historical perspective. We've built the grid over time, and as we've moved into more and more rural areas, it does become more expensive to serve that consumer. And so over time, we've developed this reliability trade-off whereby the remote areas typically will have a slightly lower or even a very much lower level of reliability than the high urban areas, but equally everyone is paying very similar prices for the cost of the network. I think over time, we're going to develop this conversation with consumers about the reliability or maybe the capacity of the dynamic operating envelopes in rural areas, because it probably is not economic to have the same levels of access in all areas. So I think there will need to be this trade-off, but before we can have the trade-off, we do need to have that conversation. And so if you imagine the way reliability is administered by the AER at the present, they look at worst served consumers, and they have different ranges of urban, very rural and very remote areas that are measured and compared differently. So I think we'll probably develop something along those lines, but there's a long way to go. And again, it's going to come back to that consumer conversation.
Often.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I mean, it's definitely a complex question, but I think one of the ways that we are starting to see it get addressed is that we're recognizing that it is, there are technical elements to it, there are economic elements to it, and there are these social elements to it. And so we're making sure increasingly that we're bringing all the right people to the table for these discussions. And I think, to bring it back to DEIP, that has been one of the great things about DEIP. We've got the technical focus, we've got that economic focus, but we're starting increasingly also to see the social science and the customer representative inputs being valued very highly. And again, that goes to the fact that ARENA has been willing to fund social science components and customer rep involvement in many of these projects. So I think thinking about it as a socio-techno-economic problem actually means that you have a chance to actually be able to solve it in that way. I think maybe the other comment I would just make is that we tend to think a lot about the consumers who have DER, and that's, there's good reasons for that, but we also do need to think about the customers who can't have DER. And, that includes vulnerable customers. It includes customers who don't own their own home or who are renting in apartments. And so again, making sure that we're thinking about how the value of DER can be shared broadly amongst all of those different customer and community groups is going to be really important.
One thing that we learned through the access and pricing work in both DEIP and the rule change is that efficiency and sort of equity don't have to be two separate concepts. They're all interrelated. And if you have a think about the, what we call sort of the old electricity system and a lot of the policy in place, it's all about making sure everyone gets an equitable, somewhat equitable access to the system from, purchase and pricing, everything. I don't think that's changed. What we need to do is just move sort of that kind of concept from where it used to be a very static system to a much more dynamic system, and think about it in how can we actually best serve all the customers, like Lachlan has said before, but with a much more fluid system and different actors doing different things. So I would certainly argue against people saying that just because we've got DER, we need to fundamentally look at how we look at the system differently. I don't think so. So long as we keep making decisions that is in the best interest of customers, I think that'll get us to the right outcome.
Okay. So given Australia's leading, particularly on the rooftop PV side of things, and probably lagging on EVs, what should be done to ensure that we keep aligned with international markets, international developments, given we are a small market in size of population, however, have a pressing need, particularly on PV? How do we ensure that we lead on regulatory reform? I think the access and pricing is the first time internationally that distribution businesses have been regulated two ways. And probably some of the work that you're doing, Lachlan, is now leading on the front edge of reforms and developments of the IEEE 2030.5. How do we ensure that we're in lockstep with the rest of the world and don't get too far out in front and find that we're out on our own?
Craig, I might kick off then, considering you referenced the standards piece. I think one of the great things that I think we have recognised when it comes to standards, as one example, is that we are a relatively small market and that these are global challenges. And so instead of going down a path of trying to have an independent Australian standard, we've looked to where developments have been made elsewhere in the world. So the Australian implementation guide borrows heavily from the fact that there is a Californian implementation guide and there's a Hawaiian implementation guide. And so I think that has been sort of a key approach where we can learn from others. I think also recognizing that others actually care about what we're doing here as well. And so rather than doing it here in Australia and being just focused here, we are increasingly engaging with standards bodies, with governments, with industry elsewhere in the world. And without putting you on the spot, Phil, and maybe you want to talk a little bit to that, because I think it is really interesting that we are focused on being part of that global conversation.
Yeah, I'll second that, Lachlan. I think the conversations that we've started to have with international bodies, and I know, Lachlan, you've been doing this as well. For example, in the UK, which is quite a forward market in terms of the transition to renewables, probably less so on the DER front, but very much at the forefront around EVs. They can learn from us around the uptake of solar and a lot of things we're doing, cutting edge there. But similarly, we can probably learn a lot from them in terms of the uptake around smart devices and EVs. And I think jurisdictions, and California included, are starting to recognise this is a global problem. Like the vendors in this space are all global. So jurisdictions can't afford to just sit, in their own little fiefdoms and work out rules that suit us, because ultimately the efficient way is to get the global manufacturers a consistent way of solving the problem. It'll be the cheapest, the fastest, and the best outcome for customers. So we've really got to start working harder to promote what we do and align everything what we do with international standards. So and I think that's that's a new thing for the energy industry globally. So the much more we can promote that, the better.
Matt, do you want to comment on whether you talk with other market operators around the world on these issues?
Yeah, we definitely do, and frequently. And I completely agree with Phil that this is very much an international market. All the vendors operate across international jurisdictions, and so it makes sense to continually engage with our international colleagues to understand what works, what doesn't, and to implement those learnings here. And I think a particular area of focus, which has been mentioned already in the next year or so, I think should be EVs, to make sure that we, although uptake at the moment is slow, we definitely want to be prepared as an industry for a very rapid uptake if that were to occur.
Okay.
I might talk a little bit about the non-technical side, given that I'm not an engineer to start with. Pricing is one of those things that cuts across sort of all the jurisdictions, whether locally or internationally. And Kate talked a bit about the value to the customer in her piece. I think a missing piece in so much of the DER conversation is how do we actually use incentives to signal to customers when is the best way to use the grid. And this ties into Anthony's very first chart to show that underutilized capacity. If we can use some kind of reward and move away from talking about pricing as if you use it at this time, it'll cost you, 20 times more. I think if we can all as a group sort of move towards, there is a benefit from using your devices, whether it be charging or discharging at a certain time of the day, you can actually benefit, and that will actually deliver value to yourself. So imagine sort of charging at next to no cost, whether it be your hot water or electric vehicle. So that, I think that's an element that we need to work on a bit more, and that complements all the technical standards, all the work that's being done in other places too.
Okay, so there's a question here in regards to much of the choice that customers have benefit or losing from in regards to DER. In the questioner's opinion, is a political decision. So, we do live in a political world where ministers make decisions around reforms and policies. I'm wondering whether I think this we've touched on this, but just to dig a bit further, the social license for the amount of reform that is necessary, and whether we've actually communicated the need yet with the customer of being able to reform. Want to take that one?
I'll start, given that access and pricing had quite a bit of coverage. I think by and large, the ability for us to have that reform carry through had a lot to do with a social license, but it was because it was a consumer-led reform. We had a number of consumer groups putting that forward and really taking the time to explain to all their constituents why there is a need and how it can actually benefit everyone, not just a group. I think without that social license, we wouldn't have been able to even commence the conversation. So as your chart, so there's a whole lot of discussion work done in building the consensus, developing the case. So I think social license is absolutely essential, especially for an industry that sort of come from with a reputation that we're not always there for the customer.
Just to pick up on that, I think we're also seeking to, amongst all of us here, to create a level playing field for new products, new services to come to the market. So we're not actually trying to define what they will be. We're just trying to create the access for consumers to all these the consumers through their agents, through these products and services will be able to see greater value from participation. So we're not trying to create the winners, not trying to pick the Apple iPhone or whatever it might be in this space. We're just trying to create a level, accessible, open set of platforms that the consumer can access. So so hopefully we take away some of the political decision making in this space.
Maybe worthwhile, just one little comment from me as well, Craig, from an AR perspective. I think the AR places great emphasis on consumer engagement and consultation, and you see that through the DNSPs and the requirements that they have on them to consult with customers in the development of their tariff structure statements. And similarly, I just note for everyone on the call that the AER has just published a consultation on its export tariff guidelines, and encourage people to have a look at that. And the theme of that, of course, is also about consumer engagement in relation to export tariffs. So that's just one level of it. But like I totally agree that to make orchestration successful and to optimize DER, the consumer engagement piece is just so important, and we need to bring the customers along with us here.
Before we jump to you, Phil, I might go to Kate, given Kate has done a lot in the social science area, and there's a distinct lack of diversity on this panel, middle-aged men. So, Kate, what do you think?
I was just going to point out the opportunity with EVs in that we can put in place these incentives and I guess offers to the customers and ways of people managing their EV charging before mass adoption, and that's why we're so excited to get into this space now, because I guess what we've seen is difficult through the access and pricing changes or the solar PV output is that people have had it for a long time one certain way, and it's very difficult to kind of get people thinking differently and make changes down the line when they're quite set in their ways. So I think that's what's exciting about the EV space. And I guess my other point was really just echoing what Ed and Lachlan had already said, which is in all of the reforms that we're tackling, we're thinking about all electricity consumers, not just the people who own DER. That's extremely important. And I think that's what the access and pricing changes sought to do. It has a lot of backing from consumer organisations when you think about that whole system. But there's a lot of work to do, I guess, in terms of communication and getting that cut through with the broader community on thinking about all consumers, not just people with an EV or people with rooftop. So whole of system approach, I guess, is what I was thinking about.
Thank you, Kate. So we might have to just finish up with Phil and then Ed, because we're soon running out of time. So over to you, Phil.
So thanks, Craig. Just wanted to have a slightly different slant on the conversation in that you mentioned that the whole policy aspect, well, the politics aspect. Obviously, the work of the ESP has particularly been very mindful of the fact that a lot of the, particularly in the DER space, a lot of the things that we do aren't necessarily incarnated at a national rules level. Very much sits with the states. In fact, well, it's both state and federal, and so that's a big coordination effort. I think that the fact we owe rooftop solar, the success of rooftop solar in Australia, to the way that the states and the federal governments have brought in subsidies and, for better or for worse, have driven the adoption of these technologies. And if we look at EVs, it's the same issue again. The EV smart charging infrastructure is expensive. It will need policy subsidies, as it does in all countries around Europe, to introduce these things. Marina's doing a great job there as well to pave the way around the introduction of these technologies. So there is a really strong aspect at the early part of the adoption curve for governments to play a role in that policy area to promote this, and we can't forget that. So while it is in the hands of consumers, there is a really strong role of government here to play hand in hand, play a supporting role for as long as is needed to get the technology in place. And there can be big economic wins at the end for doing so. So I think we just need to acknowledge that we need to work really closely with the jurisdictional policymakers to make sure that we can support these things through these early phases of adoption.
Thanks, Phil. Ed?
I might just return to the consumer consultation theme. There is everyone in the industry wanting to do customer consultation, and there are various, so many of them going on. It is important, and this is where I think DEIP can play a very important role, is to have one voice. one same message for all the customers, that instead of multiple parties trying to look at different aspects of how a customer can benefit, if we can have, across the supply chain from, rule makers, regulators, network retailer customers, or sort of trying to talk to why is it important to do the changes we need to do on DER, I think that would be quite beneficial, and it goes to talking to jurisdictional governors when explaining why, and everyone have to be on the same song sheet. I think we're getting there, but if we could coordinate that so that we're not hitting the same group of customers with the same process, just looking at customer consultation just with a slightly different angle, I think that'll be a good outcome.
Okay, given we're at time, so thank you very much to everyone on the panel, all the speakers, people behind the scenes, Jordan, Celia, who've made this event possible. I hope that everyone enjoyed the content today. To continue the conversation, we have a couple of channels for which you can communicate with us on. The ARENA website has a DEIP page, which will have and does have all the artifacts from DEIP working groups. We have a LinkedIn channel that if you ask to be invited, you'll get put onto that. And we also have an email address if you'd like to know more. A lot of the questions we didn't get to today, but they will be brought back to the workstream leads or the panelists that they were addressed to, and I'll leave it to them to come back to you. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone, for your time today, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar.